It was a cold October night, the kind where the wind bites at your face and whispers through the trees. I don't know what possessed me to take that shortcut through the woods. Maybe it was my own arrogance, thinking I knew the forest better than anyone. Maybe it was the need to prove I wasn't scared of some old stories. But now, sitting here, recounting it all, I realize I should have listened to the warnings. The woods weren't ordinary. Everyone in our small town called them the Hollow Pines. There were tales passed down about people disappearing, strange lights floating between the trees, and a constant hum that seemed to come from nowhere. "It's just the wind," the older folks would say, but no one could explain why even hunters avoided those woods. That night, I had been at a friend's party on the other side of town. It was late, and I was too impatient to wait for a ride. I figured I'd cut through the Hollow Pines and save myself a good 40 minutes. With a flashlight in hand and my phone nearly dead, I stepped into the forest. At first, it felt like any other woods. The leaves crunched underfoot, the air was damp, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the silence. But as I moved deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, the sounds of nocturnal creatures faded, and that's when I heard it, the hum. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration you could feel in your chest. At first, I thought it might be power lines, but there were none around. I stopped to listen, scanning the dark trees with my flashlight. The beam of light felt weak, swallowed by the shadows. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something metallic, but as I walked, it grew stronger. It was coppery, mixed with damp earth and something else I couldn't place, something rotten. The hum grew louder, resonating in my bones, and that's when I saw it. There was a clearing ahead, bathed in an unnatural glow. It wasn't the moonlight. The light was pale, almost greenish, and it seemed to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer like a heartbeat. Against every ounce of common sense, I moved toward it. I had to know what it was. The clearing was empty at first glance. No animals, no people. Just a patch of dead grass in the center, surrounded by trees that seemed darker and older than the ones I had passed. The glow was coming from the ground. I crouched down and saw strange symbols etched into the dirt. They weren't random. They were intricate, carved with precision. My flashlight flickered, then died. That's when I heard the whispering. It came from all around me, voices too quiet to make out but urgent, insistent. I turned in a circle, trying to find the source, but there was no one there. My chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling my ears. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and when I looked up, I saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, their shapes barely human. They were tall, their limbs too long, and their movements were unnatural, jerky, like they were being controlled by invisible strings. Their faces, or what I thought were faces, were featureless. Just smooth, pale surfaces that reflected the sickly green light. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. One of them tilted its head as if studying me, and then it reached out, its hand or claw stretched impossibly far, the fingers almost brushing my face. I snapped out of my trance and bolted. The woods were different now, the trees closer together, the paths unfamiliar. The hum followed me, louder now, joined by the sound of footsteps. Many footsteps. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, branches clawing at my face and arms, the ground uneven beneath me. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, and this time I understood them. Turn back. I stopped dead in my tracks, gasping for air. My flashlight flickered to life for a split second, illuminating the ground. It wasn't dirt anymore. It was that same strange symbol, stretched out endlessly in every direction. I wasn't running away, I was running in circles. A laugh echoed through the trees, deep and guttural, and I realized it wasn't coming from one of the figures. It was coming from above. Slowly, I tilted my head up, and my blood ran cold. Something massive loomed in the darkness, its shape barely visible against the night sky. It had too many arms, too many legs, and eyes, dozens of glowing eyes staring down at me. Its laugh shook the ground, and I felt my knees buckle. I screamed and ran again, this time blindly. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it was away from that thing. The trees thinned, the air grew colder, and suddenly I broke through the edge of the woods. I collapsed on the side of the road, shaking and gasping for breath. A truck passed by and skidded to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, jumped out and ran toward me. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I just pointed toward the woods. When he looked, his face paled. You came out of the hollow pines, he whispered almost to himself. You're lucky you made it out alive. I wanted to tell him what I saw, but the words wouldn't come. He drove me to the hospital and they said I was in shock. No one believed me when I tried to explain. They all said it was the cold or exhaustion or a trick of the mind. But I know what I saw. I know those woods aren't normal, and I know I'll never set foot in them again. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the hum.
Story number 2.
I don't even know where to start, but if I don't tell someone, it'll drive me insane. I don't think I'll ever step into the woods again. Not after what I saw. It happened last fall. My friends and I thought it'd be fun to spend the weekend camping deep in the woods, far from the usual trails. You know, just a bunch of 20-somethings wanting to prove how rugged we were. We picked a spot about an hour's hike from the road, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the light even during the day. The kind of place where the silence feels heavy. It started out like any other camping trip. We pitched our tents, started a fire, and laughed as we told stupid stories. Everything seemed fine until the sun dipped below the horizon. That's when things got weird. The first thing we noticed was the quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no crickets, no rustling in the bushes, just an oppressive silence. At first, we brushed it off as a strange coincidence, but then the sounds started. It was subtle at first, like faint whispers carried on a non-existent breeze. We all heard it, but none of us wanted to admit it. Probably just the wind, Jake said, trying to sound confident. But there was no wind. The trees were completely still. The whispers grew louder as the night went on, circling our campsite like some unseen predator. They didn't sound human. They were garbled, overlapping, and guttural, like voices speaking in a language no one was meant to understand. We tried to laugh it off, but you could feel the tension growing. Sarah, the skeptic of the group, stood up and shouted into the woods, "All right, who's out there? You're not scaring us." The whispers stopped. For a moment there was nothing but dead silence. Then we heard it, a laugh, low, rumbling, and impossibly deep. It didn't sound like it came from one throat, but from many. Sarah froze, her bravado gone. "That's not funny," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just get in the tents and call it a night," I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Everyone agreed, and we retreated to our tents, zipping them up tight like that flimsy fabric would protect us. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to my own heartbeat. Then I heard it again, the laugh. This time it was closer, much closer. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. That's when I noticed the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow, crunching the leaves just outside the tent. I wanted to call out to the others, but my voice wouldn't come. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few seconds as if whatever it was listening. Then came the scratching. It started at the base of my tent, faint at first, then growing louder as it dragged up the fabric. My mind raced. An animal? A bear? No. It felt too deliberate, too calculated. I finally mustered the courage to whisper, "Who's there?" The scratching stopped. A voice answered, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. It sounded wrong, distorted, like someone trying to mimic human speech, but failing. "Come out," it croaked, stretching the words unnaturally. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And then the thing started laughing again, that same guttural, inhuman sound. Suddenly I heard Sarah scream from her tent. It wasn't a startled scream. It was the kind of scream that made your blood run cold, primal, and raw. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. The fire had gone out, but the campsite wasn't dark. There was a light, an eerie, pulsating green glow coming from deeper in the woods. And standing at the edge of the clearing were figures. At least a dozen of them. They weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their heads too small, and their skin looked like it was stretched too tight, pale and almost translucent. They didn't move like people either. It was jerky, unnatural, like puppets on strings. They stood there, staring at us, or at least I think they were. Their faces were blank, featureless. I turned my flashlight on them, and as soon as the beam hit them, they scattered, their movements impossibly fast. But the glow remained. It pulsed brighter, almost beckoning us. Jake stumbled out of his tent, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now," he whispered. Sarah was still screaming, her tent shaking violently. Jake ran to her and unzipped it, but there was no one inside. Just her sleeping bag, torn to shreds, and that smell, coppery and rotten like blood mixed with decay. "She's gone," Jake yelled, his voice cracking. "Where did she go?" I stammered, my eyes darting to the woods. The figures were gone, but I could feel them watching us. "We're leaving," Jake said, grabbing his backpack. "I don't care where she is. We need to go before." Before he could finish, the green light surged, blinding us for a moment. When our vision cleared, Sarah was standing at the edge of the woods, bathed in the glow. But she wasn't right. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle and her arms hung limp at her sides. "Sarah?" Jake called out, stepping toward her. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly and walked into the trees, the glow retreating with her. "Wait," Jake shouted, running after her. "No!" I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, paralyzed, torn between chasing after him and staying put. That's when the whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping and chaotic. I ran. I don't even remember grabbing my stuff. I just ran as fast as I could, not caring about the direction. The whispers chased me, growing louder, more frantic. I could feel them closing in, their breath hot on my neck. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out of the woods and onto the road. A car screeched to a stop, and the driver, a woman in her 40s, jumped out. She said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't tell her the truth. I couldn't. She drove me to the nearest town, and I called the police. A search party went out the next day, but they didn't find Jake or Sarah. All they found was our campsite, the tents torn apart and the ground covered in those strange symbols. It's been months now, and I still hear the whispers at night. Sometimes I see that green glow in the distance, just beyond the tree line. I don't know what's in those woods, but I know it's not human. And I know it's still waiting.
Story number 3.
I'll never forget the night I got lost in the Blackwood Forest. It's not just the forest itself. It's what lives there. And if you think the worst thing about being lost in the woods is the cold or the wildlife, you're wrong. So very, very wrong. It started when my cousin Ryan dared me to join him and his friends for a midnight hike. He claimed the stories about Blackwood were just small-town gossip to keep kids from partying there. I didn't want to look like a coward, so I agreed. That's the thing about pride, it makes you do really stupid things. We headed out around 11:30 p.m., flashlights in hand, laughing and joking as if we weren't stepping into one of the most notoriously haunted places in the state. The woods were dense. The kind of dense where the moon barely filters through, and the air felt heavier the deeper we went. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About an hour in, we found a clearing. Ryan said it'd be a good spot to chill for a bit, maybe tell some scary stories. We built a small fire, even though the forest ranger signs strictly forbade it. The others started sharing stupid urban legends, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing at the tree line, feeling like something was out there, watching, waiting. That's when we heard the first sound. It was faint, like the distant snap of a twig, but in a forest this still, it might as well have been a gunshot. Everyone went silent, our heads whipping toward the sound. Ryan laughed it off, calling it a deer or a raccoon, but I knew better. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the underbrush. A few minutes later, we heard it again, closer this time. The snap of a twig followed by the soft crunch of leaves. The firelight didn't reach far enough to show what was beyond the clearing, and none of us dared to shine our flashlights into the trees. Ryan, ever the brave one, stood up and shouted, "Hey, if someone's out there, this isn't funny." The forest swallowed his voice, and the silence that followed was worse than any response. Then came the laugh. It was low, guttural, and didn't sound human. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding us, echoing through the trees. My stomach turned, and the hair on my arms stood on end. "Let's get out of here," I said, already grabbing my backpack. But before anyone could move, the laughing stopped, replaced by a sound I'll never forget. It was a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, at least not in any language I understood. They were faint but growing louder, overlapping in a way that made my head spin. That's when we saw the figure. It stepped into the edge of the firelight, just enough for us to make out its shape. At first, it looked like a man, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its neck too thin, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. Just hollow, black pits. No one screamed. We couldn't. The thing stood there for what felt like an eternity, swaying slightly, as if it were deciding what to do with us. Then it smiled. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. Run, someone whispered. I don't even remember who it was. We bolted in different directions, the fire forgotten, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we tore through the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but the whispers followed me, growing louder, closer. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, then the air knocked out of my lungs. I lay there gasping, listening. The whispers had stopped, but the dragging sound was back, closer than ever. I scrambled to my feet and started running again, blindly this time. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes and face. I stumbled into another clearing, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, and it looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But the door was slightly ajar, and faint light spilled out. I didn't think. I just ran for it, slamming the door shut behind me. The inside was worse than the outside. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, and the air reeked of decay. A single candle burned in the center of the room, casting long, flickering shadows. And then I saw them, photographs pinned to the walls. They were old, faded, but the faces in them were clear. Kids, teenagers, adults, all staring at the camera with the same hollow, black pits where their eyes should have been. My stomach churned, and I backed away, bumping into something solid. I turned, expecting a wall, but it wasn't. It was a figure. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the low ceiling, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I screamed and ran out of the cabin, back into the woods, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far from that thing. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. The dragging sound returned, and I swear I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near a dried-up creek bed. That's when I saw the others. Ryan and his friends were standing across the creek, but something was wrong. Their heads were tilted at odd angles, their bodies unnaturally stiff, and their eyes, those hollow black pits, stared right at me. They started walking toward me, their movements jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, my vision swimming, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and then everything went black. I woke up at dawn, lying on the side of the road. A hiker found me and called the authorities. They searched the forest for days but never found Ryan or the others. The only thing they discovered was the remains of our campsite, the fire cold, and the ground covered in strange symbols. I moved away from that town not long after, but the nightmares followed me. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, and I know that whatever lives in Blackwood Forest hasn't forgotten me.
Story number 4.
It started with an innocent road trip. Just me, my girlfriend Emily, and 2 of our friends, Mike and Lisa, driving through the back roads of Appalachia. We were heading to a music festival a few states away and decided to take the scenic route. It was supposed to be an adventure, a memory to laugh about years later. We didn't expect the memory to turn into a nightmare. The GPS failed us somewhere around dusk. We were in the middle of nowhere. No cell signal, no signs, just miles of trees on either side of the road. Emily joked about how this was how horror movies started, but there was a nervous edge to her voice. "Let's just find somewhere to pull over and check the map," Mike said. We spotted a dirt road branching off the main one and decided to take it, hoping it would lead us to a gas station or a town. Instead, it led us deeper into the forest. It was almost fully dark when we spotted it, a weathered wooden sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes. "Welcome to Ash Hollow," it read. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had scrawled, "Where the shadows never sleep." "Creepy," Lisa muttered, but Mike, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "Just some small-town weirdos trying to scare people. Let's keep going." We drove into Ash Hollow, or what was left of it. The town was abandoned, houses with boarded-up windows, a gas station with shattered glass, and a single street lamp flickering weakly. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily said, gripping my arm. I nodded, unease settling in my chest like a weight. "Let's just turn around," Lisa suggested, but as Mike tried to reverse, the engine sputtered and died. "Are you kidding me?" Mike groaned, slamming the steering wheel. He popped the hood and got out to take a look while the rest of us stayed in the car, the silence pressing down on us. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it too. A faint hum, low and rhythmic, like a distant chant. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried by the stillness of the night. Mike slammed the hood shut and climbed back in. No idea what's wrong. Battery's fine, gas tank's full. It just won't start. That's when we noticed the fog. It rolled in unnaturally fast, thick and heavy, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The street lamp flickered out, plunging us into near-total darkness. "We're not staying here," Lisa said firmly, grabbing her flashlight. "Let's find help or at least somewhere safe to wait until morning." Reluctantly, we agreed and started walking, the hum growing louder with every step. The fog seemed alive, twisting and curling around us, muffling our footsteps. The buildings loomed like skeletons of a forgotten world, their empty windows watching us. We turned a corner and froze. In the middle of the street stood a figure. At first glance, it looked human, but something was off. Its posture was rigid, its limbs too long, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It wore tattered clothing that looked decades out of place. "Hello?" Mike called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. "Let's go back," Emily whispered, tugging at my sleeve. Before we could, the figure raised its head and we saw its face, or lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight. And then it began to move, jerking forward in short, unnatural bursts, as though it were being dragged by invisible strings. We ran. The fog thickened as we sprinted down the street, our flashlights barely cutting through the murk. The hum was deafening now, reverberating in our bones. Shapes moved in the fog, fleeting and shadowy, always just out of sight. We stumbled into a church at the edge of town, its doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the wooden pews rotting and splintered. Faint light filtered through stained glass windows, casting fractured, distorted colors across the floor. "We'll wait here," Mike said, barricading the door with a broken pew. "Just until morning." But morning never came. The hum didn't stop. It surrounded us, filling the church like a living thing. And then the whispers started. They were soft at first, unintelligible, but they grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. "I hear it," Lisa whispered, her face pale. "They're saying our names." My blood ran cold. She was right. Among the chaos of whispers, I could hear them. Emily, Mike, Lisa, Jack. Over and over, our names repeated like a mantra. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to make the barricade shake. Then again, and again. "They're coming," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The door burst open, and the fog poured in like a living thing, swirling and coiling around us. Figures emerged, more of those faceless things, their bodies contorting and jerking as they moved. Their hollow faces turned toward us, and for the first time I heard them speak. "Stay." Their voices were hollow, echoing, and impossibly deep. We backed away, but the figures advanced, their movements synchronized, unnatural. "Run," Mike shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The fog closed in, and the church seemed to stretch and twist, the walls bending impossibly. One of the figures reached out, its elongated hand brushing against Lisa. She screamed, and then she was gone, swallowed by the fog. "Lisa!" Emily cried, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the church. There was a trapdoor leading to the basement, and we scrambled down, slamming it shut behind us. The basement was worse. The walls were covered in symbols, carved deep into the stone, and the floor was littered with bones. Human bones. The whispers were louder here, almost unbearable. "We're gonna die here," Emily sobbed, collapsing against the wall. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We'll find a way out." But there was no way out. The fog seeped through the cracks in the trapdoor, and the figures followed, descending into the basement one by one. The last thing I remember is their hollow faces closing in, their whispers turning into screams. Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, miles away from Ash Hollow. A trucker had found me wandering on the highway, alone and covered in scratches. They never found Emily, Mike, or Lisa. They didn't even find the town. But I know it's still there, waiting, and every night when the world is quiet I can hear the hum.
Story number 5.
The road leading out of town had a reputation. Locals called it the Devil's Turnpike, a stretch of cracked asphalt winding through dense woods and rocky hills, where headlights struggled to pierce the oppressive dark. It wasn't just the road's sharp bends or sudden drop-offs that gave it its name. It was the stories. People whispered about drivers disappearing, strange figures seen along the roadside, and cars found abandoned with their engines still running. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but I wish I had. Maybe then I wouldn't have taken that shortcut on a stormy October night. It was supposed to shave an hour off my drive. I was heading home after a long work trip, and the thought of my warm bed kept me going despite the rain hammering against my windshield. My GPS was spotty, the signal cutting in and out, but the road signs confirmed I was on the right path. The trees pressed in on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. A flicker of motion caught my eye, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road just ahead. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but something was off. The figure didn't move, even as my car approached. Its head was tilted downward as though it were staring at the ground. I slowed instinctively, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its clothing tattered and hanging in strips. As I passed, my headlights illuminated its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, I saw a blank expanse of pale skin, featureless and smooth. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding. "Just keep driving," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The road twisted and turned, the rain relentless. My wipers could barely keep up, and visibility was getting worse. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faceless figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. But it wasn't there. That's when the static started. The radio, which had been off the entire drive, crackled to life. At first, it was just white noise, but then came the whispers. Faint, distorted voices that seemed to be speaking in unison. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. I reached for the dial to turn it off, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Stop!" a voice screamed, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. My hands jerked the wheel reflexively, and the car skidded, tires squealing as I fought to regain control. I came to a stop in the middle of the road, breathing heavily. The whispers had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The only sound was the rain tapping against the roof of the car. I didn't notice it at first, but something was wrong. The forest, which had been a blur of dark shapes moments ago, seemed closer. The trees loomed over the road, their branches arching like grasping fingers. And then I saw the lights. They were faint at first, barely visible through the rain, but they grew brighter, coming toward me. Headlights, I thought with relief. Another car. I flicked my high beams to signal them, but the lights didn't respond. They just kept coming, faster now, until they were blindingly bright. And then they were gone. No car passed me, no sound of an engine, just the empty road ahead. I pressed on, my pulse racing, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the road had changed. The familiar twists and turns were gone, replaced by a straight, featureless stretch that seemed to go on forever. The trees were denser now, their trunks gnarled and blackened as though they'd been burned. A shadow darted across the road ahead, too fast to be human. My headlights caught the briefest glimpse of something hunched and long-limbed before it disappeared into the trees. I wasn't alone out here. I checked my phone again, no signal. The clock on the dashboard was frozen, the hands stuck at 12:15. I kept driving. What else could I do? The road seemed endless, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I tried to focus on the road, but the shadows seemed to move just beyond the reach of my headlights. Shapes flitted through the trees, tall, gaunt figures with glowing eyes that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. And then I saw it again. The figure from earlier, standing in the middle of the road, its head still tilted downward. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from it. It raised its head slowly, and this time it had a face. My face. The blood drained from my body as I stared into my own reflection, twisted and warped, grinning with too many teeth. The thing raised a hand and pointed past me, back the way I had come. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. The thing's grin widened, and then it began to walk toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed away. But the figure kept coming, faster now, its body contorting in impossible ways. I hit the gas, swerving around it and speeding down the road. The whispers returned, louder than ever, the static filling the car like a living thing. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice growled, low and guttural. The road began to narrow, the trees pressing in on either side. My headlights flickered, and for a terrifying moment I was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, the road was gone. I was driving through the forest itself, the car bouncing over roots and rocks, the branches clawing at the windows. The whispers turned into screams, and in the rearview mirror, I saw them, figures emerging from the trees, dozens of them, all with my face. I don't know how long I drove like that, blindly weaving through the woods, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, the car broke through the tree line and skidded onto an empty highway. The whispers stopped. The forest was gone. I pulled over, shaking, and looked at the clock. It was 12:15. My phone buzzed. Service had returned. I checked the GPS. Somehow, I was miles away from the Devil's Turnpike. I never took that road again, and I never told anyone what happened. But every now and then, late at night, I hear the static, and I see the figure in my dreams, grinning with my face, pointing to the woods.
Story number 6.
The house was known as the Blackstone Manor, and even in a town full of old, creaking buildings, it stood out. Perched on a hill surrounded by dead trees, it was the kind of place kids dared each other to approach on Halloween. They whispered about the murders, the disappearances, and the shadows that moved behind the cracked windows when no one lived there. I'd never believed in ghost stories, but when my brother went missing near the manor, everything changed. Jason wasn't the kind of guy to just disappear. He was responsible, always checking in, always keeping his promises. So when he didn't come home after heading to the hill with his camera, I knew something was wrong. The police searched the woods, the abandoned trails, and the nearby river, but found nothing. They said he must have gotten lost or fallen. But I knew better. He'd been fascinated by Blackstone Manor for years, convinced the local legends held some truth. When the authorities gave up, I didn't. Armed with a flashlight, a crowbar, and Jason's notebook, filled with his theories and sketches of the manor, I climbed the hill one cold October night to find him. The house loomed larger than I remembered, its dark silhouette cutting against the cloudy sky. The wind howled through the dead trees, making them creak and groan. The front door was ajar, its rusted hinges squealing as it swayed in the wind. "Jason?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt wrong to speak loudly here. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was heavy, damp, and filled with the scent of rot. My flashlight's beam danced across the peeling wallpaper, the sagging furniture, and the cobweb-draped chandeliers. The house was silent, except for the occasional drip of water somewhere deep within. Jason's notebook had mentioned a basement, a place he believed held the key to the manor's secrets. I found the door near the back of the house, its handle cold and sticky, like it had been touched by something wet. The steps creaked as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement smelled worse than the rest of the house, like damp earth and decay. My flashlight revealed walls lined with shelves of strange objects, jars filled with murky liquid, old photographs, and rusted tools. But it was the markings on the floor that caught my attention, symbols etched deep into the stone, forming a large circle. In the center lay Jason's camera, its strap broken and its lens cracked. "Jason?" I whispered again, stepping closer. The moment I crossed the edge of the circle, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed me, thick and impenetrable. My breath hitched as I fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against my palm until it sputtered back to life. The beam revealed something new, something impossible. The walls had changed. What had been shelves and stone was now flesh-like, pulsating and wet. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, casting an eerie red light, and I wasn't alone. Figures stood in the shadows just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They were tall and gaunt, their skins stretched tight over their bones. Their faces were blank, featureless, except for their eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to drink in the light. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hands. The figures didn't move, but their presence pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. "Why are you here?" A voice rasped, low and guttural. It didn't come from the figures, but seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. "I'm looking for my brother," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said. The figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The light from the symbols on the floor grew brighter, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. Something moved behind me. I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of Jason, or something that looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and lifeless, and his clothes were tattered and stained. "Jason!" I cried, reaching out to him. He didn't respond, just stood there, swaying slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was wrong, hollow, as though it came from somewhere deep inside him. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a chill down my spine. Jason, it's me. We need to get out of here. They won't let you, he said, his head tilting unnaturally to the side. They've already marked you. Before I could respond, the figures surged forward, their movements inhumanly fast. I swung the crowbar wildly, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. One of the figures crumpled to the ground, but the others didn't stop. Jason, or the thing that wore his face, watched silently as I fought, his expression unreadable. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls pulsing and closing in. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, blinding me. And then I was somewhere else. The basement was gone, replaced by a vast, dark expanse. The ground beneath me felt like stone, cold and unyielding. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of iron and earth. In the distance, I saw a massive structure, a monolith carved with the same symbols I'd seen in the basement. The figures were there too, standing in a circle around the monolith. In the center was Jason, his arms outstretched, his head tilted back. The symbols on his skin glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the monolith. "Stop this!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the vast emptiness. The figures turned toward me in unison, their void-like eyes locking onto mine. "You cannot save him," the voice said, louder now, reverberating through the air. "He is ours." "No," I screamed, rushing toward Jason. The figures moved to block me, but I swung the crowbar with all my strength, the metal shattering their brittle, bone-like limbs. I reached Jason and grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Jason, wake up! We have to go!" His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment I saw the brother I knew. "Run," he whispered. Before I could react, the ground beneath us trembled. The monolith cracked, releasing a deafening roar. The figures dissolved into ash, their forms collapsing as the air grew heavier. Jason pushed me away. "Go!" he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "It's too late for me." "I'm not leaving you," I yelled, but the ground split beneath him, a chasm opening and swallowing him whole. I screamed his name as the monolith exploded, a blinding light consuming everything. When I woke up, I was on the hill outside the manor. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Jason's notebook lay beside me, open to a page with one word scrawled across it: "Run." I never found him. The town moved on, the hill was avoided, and Blackstone Manor faded into legend. But sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice, whispering from the shadows, calling my name.
Story number 7.
It started with the knocking. Faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old farmhouse settling into the ground. I didn't think much of it. Not at first. We lived far from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by miles of dense, tangled forest. It wasn't uncommon for animals to paw at the doors or windows, curious about the light inside. But the knocking didn't stop. It was past midnight, and my husband Mark was working late at the hospital. I was alone in the house, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a mystery novel, when the sound came again, 3 sharp knocks on the back door. I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. We didn't get visitors this late, especially not out here. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, pretending I hadn't heard. But curiosity won out. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and made my way to the kitchen, where the back door was. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" No answer. I hesitated before flicking on the porch light and peering through the glass. The yard was empty, the light casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. My pulse quickened. Maybe it was just a prank, kids messing around, though we lived far enough out that it seemed unlikely. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and went back to the couch, trying to shake off the unease. But the quiet of the house now felt oppressive, and I found myself straining to listen for any sound beyond the ticking of the clock on the wall. And then it came again. This time, it wasn't at the back door. It was at the window directly behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding. The curtain was drawn, but I could see the faintest outline of a shadow on the other side, motionless. My breath caught in my throat. "Whoever you are, you need to leave," I shouted, clutching my phone tightly. "I'm calling the police." The shadow didn't move. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911, my hands slick with sweat. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, but as I explained the situation, the shadow disappeared. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. They told me it was probably an animal or my imagination, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I could tell they didn't believe me. That was just the beginning. The next few nights I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows had me on edge. Mark tried to reassure me, saying it was likely just some teenager pulling a prank, but he didn't hear the knocking. He didn't see the shadow. And then, 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, Mark was home. We were both in bed when the sound echoed through the house, 3 sharp knocks coming from the front door. Mark sat up, groggy but alert. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, my throat dry. "It's them. The knocking." He frowned, throwing on his robe. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the baseball bat he kept under the bed. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go, but the words wouldn't come. I listened as he made his way downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. And then I heard him shout. I ran to the top of the stairs, my heart in my throat. "Mark, what is it?" He didn't answer. Slowly, I descended the stairs, gripping the banister tightly. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Mark was nowhere in sight. "Mark!" I screamed, my voice breaking. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The porch light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the yard. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and angular. Its head was tilted to the side as if observing me. "Mark?" I shouted again, but he didn't answer. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I backed into the house, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage to slide the deadbolt into place. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. When they arrived, they found no sign of Mark. The footprints leading from the porch to the woods stopped abruptly, as though he'd simply vanished. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no trace of him. The police said he'd probably wandered into the woods and gotten lost, but I knew better. Something had taken him. I started seeing the figure everywhere. In the reflection of the bathroom mirror, standing at the edge of the yard during the day, and even once in the rearview mirror of my car as I drove to town. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just watched. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I became a ghost of myself, consumed by fear and guilt. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. It felt wrong, like the walls were closing in. I packed a bag and checked into a motel on the edge of town, hoping distance would give me some peace. But it didn't. The knocking followed me. It started again on the 3rd night at the motel, faint and rhythmic, coming from the window. I didn't even look this time. I knew what I'd see. The figure was inside the motel room when I woke up. I don't know how it got in. One moment I was lying in bed, the thin curtains barely blocking out the neon light from the parking lot, and the next, it was there, standing at the foot of my bed. Up close, it was worse than I'd imagined. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its face featureless except for 2 black pits where its eyes should have been. Its head tilted as it regarded me, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered, its voice low and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as it reached out with one long, spindly hand. Its touch was cold, like ice, and I felt the world tilt and spin as darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I was back in the house, lying on the floor of the living room. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows boarded up. It looked as though no one had lived there in years. And I wasn't alone. Mark stood in the corner, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me with the same empty stare as the figure. I tried to get up, to run, but my legs wouldn't work. The knocking started again, louder this time, echoing through the house, and then the door creaked open.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to escape the stress of city life. My friends and I had rented a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, miles from the nearest town. The promise of crisp mountain air, serene hiking trails, and starlit skies was too good to pass up. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Luke, his brother Kevin, and Maddie, Sarah's cousin. We were all close, and the idea of spending a few days off-grid sounded like a perfect retreat. The cabin was rustic but charming, nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. The first day was idyllic. We hiked, grilled dinner, and laughed around a crackling fire as we roasted marshmallows under a blanket of stars. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, the forest seemed to grow, darker. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the noises of the woods, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves seemed louder, closer. That's when the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely audible over our laughter and the crackling of the fire. 3 soft, deliberate knocks coming from the direction of the woods. We froze, the laughter dying in our throats. "Did you hear that?" Maddie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just a branch falling or an animal," Luke said, trying to sound nonchalant, but his eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "Animals don't knock," Sarah muttered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Kevin, ever the skeptic, stood up. "Relax, guys. It's the woods. There's bound to be weird noises." He picked up a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. "I'll check it out." "Kevin, don't," Maddie said quickly, but he was already walking toward the sound. We watched as the beam of his flashlight bobbed through the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. "Anyone out here?" Silence. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin came back, shrugging. "Nothing out there," he said. "Probably just the wind knocking a branch against something." We tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. The fire burned lower, and we decided to call it a night. The knocking woke me up. It was louder this time, insistent, coming from the cabin's front door. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more knocks. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered from the bunk across the room. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. The others stirred, and soon we were all awake, huddled in the small living room. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Luke grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his jaw set. "Stay here," he said, motioning for us to stay behind as he approached the door. "Be careful," Sarah said, clutching my arm. Luke opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows. But there was no one there, just the empty clearing and the dark wall of trees beyond. "See? Nothing," Kevin said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. Luke closed the door and locked it. "Probably just some prank," he said. "Kids messing with us. In the middle of nowhere?" Maddie asked, her eyes wide. "Who would?" A loud crash cut her off. It came from the back of the cabin. We screamed, scrambling to our feet. Luke and Kevin grabbed their flashlights and ran to check, while the rest of us stayed in the living room, clutching each other. They came back moments later, pale and shaken. "The back window," Luke said. "It's shattered. Something through this." Kevin held up a large rock, his hands trembling. "Something or someone," Maddie whispered. We were terrified, but tried to stay rational. Maybe it really was just a prank, some locals messing with the city folk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker, as if the forest itself was watching us. We decided to stick together for the rest of the night, sleeping in the living room with the doors and windows locked. But none of us got much sleep. The next morning, the unease hadn't lifted. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the silence oppressive. We decided to cut our trip short and leave that day. But when we went outside to pack the car, our plans changed. Every window of the car was shattered. The tires were slashed, and deep gouges ran along the sides as if something with claws had raked against it. "What the hell?" Kevin exclaimed, pacing around the car. "Who would do this?" "Whoever was knocking last night," Maddie said, her voice trembling. We were stranded. The nearest town was miles away, and without cell service, we had no way to call for help. "We'll hike to town," Luke said, trying to sound calm. "It's a long walk, but it's our only option." We packed some water and snacks, leaving most of our things behind, and set off down the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The forest closed in around us, the trees so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. After an hour of walking, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. A dead deer lay in the middle of the road, its body twisted and mangled. Its eyes were wide open, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. "What the hell could have done that?" Sarah whispered. "No predator kills like this," Luke said, his face pale. We skirted around the deer, our pace quickening. The forest seemed to grow darker, the air heavier, and then we heard it again, knocking. But this time it was coming from all around us. We froze, spinning in circles, trying to pinpoint the source. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the trees. "Run!" Luke shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. We bolted down the road, the sound of the knocking following us, growing louder with every step. It wasn't just knocking now. There were whispers, faint and indistinct, but chilling. The road seemed endless, the trees closing in on us. Maddie tripped and screamed, and when we turned to help her, we saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the road, impossibly tall, it's too long, its head cocked to the side. Its face was a blur, as if it couldn't fully form, but its presence was suffocating. "Go!" Maddie screamed, pushing us away. "Just go!" But none of us could move. The figure raised one long, bony arm and pointed at us. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie, deafening silence. And then the lights went out. Not just the sunlight filtering through the trees, everything. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by darkness. I felt Sarah's hand clutching mine, her nails digging into my skin, and then nothing. I woke up in the clearing near the cabin. The sun was shining, the birds chirping, as if nothing had happened. But the others were gone. I searched for hours, calling their names, but there was no trace of them. No footprints, no sign of a struggle. Just nothing. Eventually I made it to town, disheveled and half-mad with fear. I told the police everything, but they didn't believe me. They said the others had probably gotten lost or decided to leave without me. But I know the truth. I still hear the knocking sometimes late at night. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. And when I look out the window, I see the forest. Dense, dark, and waiting.
Story number 9.
It was the summer of 1998, and I'll never forget it. Not for as long as I live. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the summer I ventured into the deep woods of Appalachian, West Virginia. I wish I could tell you it's just a story, something to scare you, but I lived it. And not all of us made it out alive. It started with a camping trip. Me, my boyfriend Mark, his best friend Joey, and Joey's girlfriend Claire. Mark and Joey had grown up in these parts, and they swore they knew the woods like the back of their hands. They talked about finding this perfect spot, a clearing deep in the forest that Joey's grandfather had told him about when they were kids. Something about that spot had always intrigued Joey, and now he wanted to find it. We drove as far as the old dirt road would take us and hiked the rest of the way in. At first, the forest felt alive in the best way. Birds chirping, the sun filtering through the canopy, and the earthy smell of moss and pine. But the deeper we went, the quieter it became. By the time we reached the clearing, it was as if the forest had decided to hold its breath. The clearing itself was strange. The trees formed an almost perfect circle around it, their trunks twisted and gnarled like they were reaching for each other. In the middle stood an old, crumbling stone structure. It wasn't big enough to be a house, maybe more like a shrine. Moss and vines had taken over, and I remember thinking it looked like something that had no business being there. We set up camp on the edge of the clearing, and Joey, of course, wanted to explore the shrine. He called it cool and ancient, but I just felt uneasy. The air inside the clearing was heavier, thicker, like it was weighing down on us. Even Mark, who always played it cool, seemed on edge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. But then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. The silence was so complete that it made my ears ring. And that's when we heard it. At first, it sounded like a woman sobbing, faint and distant. We all froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. Claire clutched Joey's arm and whispered, "Maybe someone's lost out there." Mark shook his head. "It's probably just the wind." But it didn't sound like the wind. It grew louder, closer, and more distinct. It wasn't just sobbing, it was a low, guttural wail that made my stomach turn. Against every ounce of my better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and followed the sound. The beam of my flashlight wavered as my hands trembled. We moved as a group, stepping cautiously into the dense woods. The sound seemed to dart around us, moving from one side to the other. It was like it was playing with us, leading us deeper and deeper into the forest. And then we saw her. She was standing in the distance, her back to us. A woman, draped in a tattered white dress that seemed too bright for the moonlight. Her hair hung in long, dark strands, tangled and matted. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Joey, in his infinite stupidity, whispered, "Ma'am, are you okay?" She turned her head slightly, just enough for us to see the edge of her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes... God! Her eyes, they were black pits, voids that seemed to pull the light out of the air. She grinned, but it wasn't a smile meant for humans. It was a predator's grin, sharp and hungry. Claire screamed, and the woman moved. She didn't run. She didn't walk. She glided toward us faster than any of us could react. Mark grabbed my arm, and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush as if our lives depended on it. Because they did. The forest seemed to change as we ran. The trees grew closer together. The path we'd come in on was gone, and it was like the forest itself was trying to trap us. I could hear Claire crying, Joey cursing, and Mark whispering, keep running, like a mantra. We made it back to the clearing, but something was different. The shrine was glowing faintly, a sickly green light pulsating from its cracks. The air smelled like sulfur, and I swear the stones looked like they were shifting and rearranging themselves into something that shouldn't exist. Joey started yelling at us to help him destroy it. It's the shrine, he screamed. It's her anchor. We have to break it. But before we could move, she was there. Not the woman. We realized then she wasn't a woman at all. She was something ancient, something cruel, something that had been waiting. Her form twisted, her limbs elongating unnaturally as she emerged from the shadows of the trees. She didn't attack. She just stood there, watching us with those endless black eyes, her grin growing wider and wider. And then she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard, "You shouldn't have come." Joey grabbed a rock and hurled it at the shrine, and that's when all hell broke loose. The ground beneath us shook, the air filled with an ear-splitting screech, and the light from the shrine erupted in blinding flashes. I remember Mark pushing me to the ground, covering me with his body as the chaos unfolded. When it was over, she was gone, but so was Joey. We searched for him until dawn, screaming his name until our voices gave out. But the woods had swallowed him, and we knew we weren't welcome there anymore. We didn't speak as we packed up camp and left, each of us haunted by the memory of her face. A week later, Claire went missing. She'd been driving home late one night and never made it. They found her car on the side of the road, the driver's door wide open, and no sign of her anywhere. Mark and I don't talk about that trip. We don't talk much at all anymore. But sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of sobbing coming from the woods behind my house, and I wonder if she's waiting for me, too.